Welcome to another episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dusick. I was the founding drummer of Maroon 5. I'm now a registered therapist, author, and mental health advocate. My co-host, as always, is Duck Maillard. How you doing, Duck?
I'm good. I'm a summer. That's what we learned in our upcoming interview with Morley. I'm a summer, light, breezy. You guys are more winters, but we'll get into that.
What did you mean by that? What season? How does?
Are you not familiar with the concept of seasons as like the coloring and like your skin tone?
You're referring to coloring.
Yes.
See, I took it as like winter is aging.
Well, yeah, I think that
graying.
in the terms of the context of the conversation that we're about to have, yes. But I could also see it as personality. Like, you know, if someone is kind of cold and distant, they could be a winter, which I'm not implying you are. And if they're kind of fun and outgoing, gregarious, that's summer, which I'm not implying I am. But anyway.
Got it. So we're having a conversation today with a really interesting guy.
Yeah.
He's a street artist, which is a world that I will be honest, have very little knowledge or understanding. Before this conversation, I hadn't really talked to anyone in that world.
Mm-hmm.
The visual arts in general is not my strong suit, but I'm a big fan of film,
right?
And a lot of the visual mediums. But you come from that world more than I do, and so it's interesting to have hear some of these conversations that you guys are,
especially as a counterpoint, shall we say, to some of the other guests we have, which are maybe fall more in the business and CEO realm, where there's a lot of not emphasis on, but certainly more of a focus on succeeding on a tangible level and overcoming, shortcomings and fears and things like that, where our conversation with Morley, I think, touches more on kind of the personal journey and what art means as a whole. I mean, we get into some cool topics about why we create art, why we feel compelled to. Is it selfish? Is it ego-driven? Or is it truly because we want to share a message? We get into a lot of that stuff. It's a good conversation.
Well, it's fun for me because it's kind of straddles that line of the world that I lived in as a musician,
right?
But then also crossing over into talking about how some of that applies to just us as human beings and the mindset of an artist. Is it really that different from the mindset of others in terms of creativity and just, connecting with art or creating art is, there's a relationship there. And so we get into some of the interplay between those things. So it's a fascinating conversation with Morley.
I hadn't seen him since before the pandemic. Like he's one of those friends that we go years without seeing each other, not by choice, and it's okay to not see that. You and I, we talk sometimes about the friends that's the opposite, where we really strive to reach out and we're the ones who like try to make plans, and then those people, they bail on us, and it's sometimes you go, why do I keep trying so hard? This person is telling me, they're telling me how important my relationship is to them. And
when am I going to listen?
Right. When am I going to learn when someone shows you who they are type of thing?
Yeah.
So it's nice to have a friend, like I said, like Morley, who I can go a long time without seeing, and we just fall back into the old patterns and the old rhythms and stuff.
Yeah. I never would have guessed that it had been that long.
Right?
So you do get the sense that he's one of those friends that it's like no time has passed.
And I think it's also a testament to the modern age of, I see him every day on Instagram and on Facebook. It's like you feel like you see people even though you're not spending time with them. So it doesn't feel like, we have to catch up, because I know what's been going on with his life and he knows what's going on with mine. We talk about our kids and things like that. So.
And this was your first foray into talent booking. For
right. I hope I did well. I hope he delivered, because typically you've been handling bringing the guests in. So this was the first guy that I was like, I think this guy would be a great conversation. And I personally, I think we achieve what we are always shooting for here, which is a really kind of revealing conversation about the psyche of, in this case, an artist, and why he is motivated, driven to do the things he does in the way that he does them.
Well, you've done well, my young master. Yes. You've brung in.
Stay tuned for the offshoot podcast where I just book all my own clients and stuff.
All right, so without further ado, we're going to get into our conversation with street artist and filmmaker Morley. Here it is. Morley, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Very cool. So this is Duck's first foray into.
So don't embarrass me.
I'm going to do my best. I won't tell any embarrassing stories of the old days.
Right.
So how did you guys meet? How do you know each other? What's the relationship?
Well, you met my wife, because I had to check with her. I was like, tell me the story. And basically, so my wife is a casting producer for reality television, and she was simply looking to hire like an editor, a casting editor. So they film all the auditions, and then someone has to cut it down to like a little quick sizzle. And if I'm not mistaken, you just applied like anybody else. And she was like, yeah, all right, this guy seems normal. Because you had to be like in a room with just the three ladies. What show was that? Was it Bridezilla's?
The first one we worked on was MTV's Sex with Mom and Dad with Dr. Drew.
It's a working title. We're still working on it.
I don't remember that one.
Yeah, very forgettable. That was one of the first gigs that I had, and when I moved to Los Angeles was working in those casting things. And it's so funny how with those tapes, it was a lot of interviewing people and then, trimming them down to the bare minimum of like the essence of who they were, and then sort of trying to make them as appealing as possible. And it's pretty quick, I think, moving to LA, when you sort of get a sense of like, oh, so this is how LA is, you sort of are like, even just in that casting process of like watching an interview and being like, wow, this person seems really great. And like, no, she's not camera ready. And you're like, oh, and just throw that tape away.
And these aren't even actors. These are real people who just want to be on a reality show.
Yes, which is a unique kind of desperation. Sounds mean, but it is. I would say, like one of the other shows that I worked on with your wife was called Reality Hell, which on its face sounded like a great premise. And it was basically like a prank show where everybody knows that this is a fake reality show except one person who thinks it's real. And we basically just put them through hell. Then we say like, we were just kidding.
Which is the concept of Jury Duty, which was just a great show.
Totally.
And I think they did it
totally
well.
And I think that it's funny because that show nailed it in terms of understanding like, okay, but we're not trying to make the person who agreed to do this the butt of the joke.
Right.
We're trying to make them the straight man to the insanity that's going on around them. But like the first episode was like a fake America's Next Top Model thing. And so they had some poor girl like wearing like a dog collar, drinking champagne from a dog food bowl. And when at the very end, they're like, hey, we're just kidding. You're not even really on a reality show. She had to be like, oh, I made a fool of myself and I sacrificed every ounce of my dignity so that you could have a good laugh at my expense. And really quickly,
cool.
Jess and I just realized like, this is horrible. Like we feel awful being a part of this whole thing.
I think that might be the only job my wife was fired from because she refused to do it. I think she was basically quitting. She was like, I can't be a part of this. And they were like, well, then you're fired. And she was like, you can't fire me. I quit.
That was one of the most toxic shows I've ever been a part of. And it was definitely the one that made me realize like, oh, I need to not do this anymore. The only other, I think then we worked together on Bridezilla's, and then
another great cross section.
Another classy show. But then we didn't work together on this. The last casting thing I ever worked on was Undercover Boss.
Right.
And one of the funniest things that happened while working on that show is so it would send people out and interview people at different locations. And they would say like, oh, it's just for like another reality show. It has nothing to do with, they wouldn't give away that it was Undercover Boss, but they would just be interviewing these employees so that they could then, if the employees and the location was good, they could send the boss there and the boss could interact and change their lives and all that other stuff. So they sent these casting people to interview everybody at this one Fatburger location in Los Feliz where I was living at the time. Each person gets an hour and they all talk about their life story and what they're going through and the challenges they've faced in their life and are currently, suffering through. And then they take those tapes, they would send them to me. I would cut them down from the 45 minutes they'd interviewed them down to like 6 minutes. But the weird thing was that I then went into the Fatburger having known about every person that was working in that Fatburger. And it was like a moment of like, I could say, your sister right now is going through chemotherapy. And just like totally like mess with them and be like, the cook back there, he's dealing with this problem. And just like, it made me feel like I'm like God right now in this situation.
It's too much power for one man.
Right, exactly. And I was like, what do I say anything? That I intimately know these people. They have never met me and would not know why I have any of this information. So it was a really strange predicament to be in. And I just ordered my veggie burger and left.
Went on your way. Well, I feel like I should set the stage a little bit for the viewers at home and for Ryan as well, because Morley is one of those guys that's really annoying because anything he sets his mind to and tries, he succeeds. And it's really frustrating because like, he's like, I'm going to be an artist. And normally when your friends are like, I painted a picture of a boat, and you'd be like, that's good job, buddy. But then he actually pulls it off and becomes a really successful street artist. And, he, as a filmmaker, we all in the early 2000s were like, I'm going to make my own movie. but Morley actually did it and like made these 2 great movies that I've seen that, you know, went to film festivals and, you know.
That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said.
That
to
you're
me.
really annoying?
Yeah, honestly. Because,
annoyingly successful?
Well, especially because to me, I have felt like every single thing I have ever attempted to do in my life has required so much effort. And I'm so jealous of people who can get good at something effortlessly. I have a son and I was thinking about how like, what am I going to tell him about dreaming and what dreams are like? And I was thinking about this morning about how dreams and chasing your dreams and aspirations, if you live in LA and you're dreaming of being, you know, in the industry. When I was growing up, I'm from Iowa, and in the Midwest, you know, the idea of Hollywood and the idea of Los Angeles is this very mythical place where dreams come true. I also grew up in the 90s where this idea of like, you know, Kevin Smith is just working at a convenience store and he makes Clerks. You know,
Robert
Tarantino,
Rodriguez,
Tarantino's working at a video store and the next day he just makes Reservoir Dogs and his life is different. And you move out here with those ideas of this is how the world works, you know, like your talent just can't help but escape from you.
Right.
And people can't help but recognize that talent. And you move out here and first you realize all of those stories are completely like apocryphal and fantasized, you know? And then you also just realize how much more soul crushing a lot of it can be. And I think that it's like living and growing up in LA will be kind of like how if you're a person who smokes cigarettes now, there's no misconception about it. You can't be like the parents in the 50s who are like, we didn't know that it was going to kill us. We didn't know. We all got addicted and then realized it was really bad for us. And the doctors said 4 out of 5 doctors, you know, all that stuff. Now it's like, if you smoke, you know that it's bad for you. You choose to do it. And there are plenty of people that do that. And it's like, that's completely their choice. That's sort of what I think like growing up in LA will be like. It's like, you're chasing this and you have to know, you know, like your son obviously is very much a part of the performing and, you know, and it's the kind of thing where it's like, he's not going to grow up with the misconception of like, everything is a fairy tale. And, you know, it's like, he's going to go in with his eyes open because it's just part of his environment. For me, it's going to be interesting. I think also raising a son in this city and realizing like, you know, the things that you do, you got to go in with a true understanding of it. And I don't mean to say this like kill his innocence or his sense of like wonder. Growing up, I feel like our parents, our generation's parents, they were reacting to their generation, their parents. And so I think a lot of what they had decided was really important for them was to impart to their children, you can do anything you set your mind to. Like, just, you know, just stick with it and you will accomplish your goals because we believe in you. And I think that's a wonderful thing, but I do feel like our generation was not equipped to handle failure in the same way. We were not equipped to process through the realities of an unkind world, you know? And we were kind of given this support, but not prepared for the eventuality that the things that we thought would fulfill us won't. There's plenty of talented people that are not successful. Sometimes all of those things are these like very, you know, cold buckets of water that get thrown on you at various times when you're chasing your dreams. And I think that for me, I feel like as a parent, I want to try and get better at allowing my child to understand those realities in a safe and hopefully encouraging, but realistic way, you know?
Yeah.
This is so interesting for me because you're touching on some things that I've been thinking about a lot lately in my life. Because I did grow up in LA. I was around the entertainment industry. My aunt was a big TV star at the time. She was a film and Broadway star before that. And I went into music totally naively, like without any sort of notion about how hard it is to actually have success and what the realities of that were. I mean, we were just idiot kids in a garage dreaming the same way that anyone else in any other place in the country would. And just like, oh, we can go book a gig on the Sunset Strip and maybe we'll get some fans to come and eventually we'll get a record deal and then we'll put out a big album and we'll be rock stars. And like, we didn't even think twice about it. And we came from a generation in which our parents were very well meaning. I don't know if it was the fact that they were the children of the Depression era, our grandparents' generation, right? And in particular, my family, my dad's family came from Eastern Europe before that. And it was, Depression era Jews just coming to this country and wanting to make something. And so my dad just had this very idealistic attitude of like, follow your dreams. We worked really hard to give you the opportunity to do whatever it is that you want to do. And I never felt any pressure to be anything other than what I felt passionate about and what was fulfilling to me. And in some ways, the thing that I've been thinking about lately is that I'm so grateful for that because it allowed me to pursue my dreams and it allowed me to be sort of innocently optimistic about what the world holds for me. But in some ways, I feel like not only was I coddled a little bit and I wasn't prepared for failure and for the things that really hit me hard later in life when I did have to deal with those realities, but also I don't think I ever learned certain realities about the cutthroat nature of industry in general. That wasn't even like a part of my perception.
Right.
And so I think there is a balance to be drawn. I'm not a parent myself, but when you're raising your kids, you talk about like allowing them to understand the realities of the world, but at the same time, not squashing their dreams.
Right.
So how do you kind of balance those two realities?
Recognize the root of what is being chased. I think so many people move out to LA and they think they're chasing a specific goal, but really they're chasing a feeling that goal will create. So it's like, if I make enough money, if I get enough success, if I hear enough applause, I'll feel valuable.
You've been reading my journal.
Really what you want is to feel valuable. So it's like, I'm always of the mind that like, is there multiple ways to do that? Can you feel valuable, or can you feel some measure of what you're chasing without having to sort of create this very narrow path for it, And so I feel like if a person is coming out to be, say, an actor, what is it about that process that they like so much? Because if they're genuinely like, I just really like performing and living in other people's shoes and being able to impart the human experience in a way that is then articulated so that the viewer can understand themselves better and all of the very noble elements of being an actor, it's like, great. Can you do that, in a black box theater in LA? Or is it something that has to be done on an IMAX screen and you have to be the lead and all this other stuff? Like, is it possible that you can see those different elements of what you want and achieve them? Like as a band, like, is it possible? Like when you said you guys, like, we wanted to like be rock stars, like, is there a version of that you might go back to your younger self and say like, but what about just playing music in general? And not the rock star part, but just the musician part. And so therefore, when you then achieve those things, you then will have this sense of accomplishment and the sense of fulfillment that isn't part of, or that isn't infected by this very vague notion of what it means to be a rock star or means to be successful, because you'll probably never be successful enough or successful in the right way, or you'll be successful in a way that comes with drawbacks that you were like, I didn't know that this was going to be something that I was agreeing to when I was chasing this dream and all these other elements. So for me, I feel like it's finding the root of what you want and then trying to broaden out how to accomplish that.
When you went to film school, I have to imagine you were probably pretty idealistic. Do they prepare you in film school for any of those realities? Did you know what you were getting yourself into?
It's tough because I think that there's also this element of the era that you sort of come up in. I think it's very similar for music in terms of like I just finished Chuck Klosterman's book on the 90s, and he talks about in that like how in the 90s there was this now very outdated notion of being like a sellout that no one really understands, no one really like holds themselves to now, but like the level of integrity that a lot of 90s musicians felt and imposed upon themselves it doesn't exist in the same way as it did back then.
So true.
To some degree, like when I was in film school, there was this idea of like 90s Sundance, Miramax, indie style kind of notion of the film industry and the sort of like renegade kind of qualities of that. And they definitely did not do as good of a job as they could have of being like, also it's just a job and you need to work and you need to make money. And so you're going to do things that are not necessarily part of your art per se, but learning to use your skill as a trade, The other thing that I will say though about film school, I was fortunate enough to go to a film school called the School of Visual Arts out in New York. And it was not just a film school. It had all the different art forms. And so I was sort of exposed to a lot of different mediums that I think allowed me to recognize, oh, I can express myself in multiple ways, that because film is a very narrow way of creating art. There's so many different layers. I feel like of all of the art forms, that's the one that can create the most frustration, because there's so many aspects of it that need to come together before you can say, like, I made a movie, check it out. Even like with music, it's like you can record something on a 4-track recorder and be like, I made something, do you want to hear it? You can play a show and invite people to come. With movies, it's like, and specifically for me, it was screenwriting. It's like, I have all these blueprints. Who wants to help me make this blueprint of a building? And they're all like, no thanks. And you're like, oh, okay. So then what am I if I'm not creating anything? I'm just a person who's creating the ideas of something. And so that's sort of how I then got into street art. Was I sort of said, I need to release this pent up creative frustration, feel like I'm communicating with the world around me. And hopefully within that, I can get some sense of like, I'm living out my purpose,
But also the sense of immediacy of, here's the art that I made, I put it up, I can literally watch someone walk by and go, oh, that's cool. Versus a film where, I think all of us thought, all right, you make this movie and immediately you're the super. Well, there's a 2-year window where you write the film, you shoot the film, you edit the film, you score the film, you color correct the film, you literally 2 years ago was when you started this journey, and the enthusiasm has probably died. The excitement, and so there is not that immediacy of here's what I created and here's the reaction.
Right.
It's here's what I created too. I was a different person then.
Yeah. Totally. I think there's also an element of the fleeting nature of things becomes really a challenge when you're an artist, that it takes 2 years and you can be like, and then it got, this is if you're very fortunate, then it got on Netflix. And then 2 weeks later, it was just another movie on Netflix. And it was just like, and the thing that you've created that was birthed out of you in a creative, capacity is now just content and is just sort of being flushed into the world with billions of other options. Then, it's like it's either criticized and people are like, not good enough. And you're like, oh, okay. I mean, I spent,
right.
last 2 years of my life or 10 years or however many years trying to get this made. And you listened to it, if it's an album, for 15 minutes and then wrote your review saying it was lazy, or whatever type of a thing. So there's that. And then on top of that, there's also just this sense of like, even if it's beloved, it's like beloved for that 5 minutes.
Sure.
So for me, there was also something really freeing about creating something that was intentionally temporary and would be like, yeah, this is probably not going to last a week. I'm going to paste this up here and it's going to either get painted over or ripped down or pasted over by somebody else. And I have to be comfortable with that. Otherwise, I would, work with marble and a chisel, and try and creating something that has, more longevity in that way. And I think that it's important that we as people get comfortable with our temporary place on this earth, and realize like, because I think that especially when you're young and idealistic, you become very fixated on the notion of legacy. You get very fixated on this idea of like, it doesn't matter if I'm unhappy, because just like Van Gogh, when I die, all of my work will live on. And you sort of, I think for me, there was this moment when I got older, and I think especially when you find those elements that remind you of your own mortality. I think having a child is certainly one of those things where you sort of realize like, oh, you know what? I don't know if legacy matters to me in terms of like what I leave behind beyond like the job of making this person a good human being, and being happy with the time I have, rather than saying like, no, I'm putting my time on this planet on the altar of art. And that means if I have to be miserable, but I'm creating something that will live on past me, then it's worth it. And that sounds all very good, but you sort of realize that it's not as selfless as it actually is. It's more narcissistic ultimately. You know what? Maybe we just should enjoy our place and get, our time that we have here, and get less fixated on this notion of like creating something that we're going to leave behind, because I just don't know if it's worth it, Yeah.
It's a good segue to talk about your art, because I mean, it's one of the reasons that I thought you'd be a great guest, because specifically, not to be reductive of graffiti as a whole or street art as a whole, but a lot of times I think people can just shrug it off as like, oh, someone wrote the word fuck on the wall. Right. Hilarious.
Yeah.
But you made a very conscious choice to have your art, and I won't go so far as to say always inspirational, but you definitely, there's a sense that you wanted to have someone walking by who maybe was having a bad day and sees your message and gets lifted up a little bit, or
Right.
that's exactly what I needed to hear at this moment. Talk a little bit about your decision to not just create this art, but to create this art with a message that specifically spoke to, a sense of positivity, a sense of like, hey, things aren't so bad, or if they are bad, they won't always be this bad, and let me lift you up a little bit.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. I think that's always the goal, certainly, because for me, it was again, this frustration I was feeling being in LA. And I think knowing that I'm surrounded by other people that are in the same position as me. And I wanted to create some messages that would, if I passed, would be meaningful to me. So that's sort of always where I would start, being like, what is a message that I wish I could hear right now? I was thinking about when you have, and I keep talking about having a kid. I apologize.
I do
if
it too.
Becomes,
it's okay. It's going to be the harder to breathe drinking game. Anytime Duck mentions his son,
exactly. But like when you have a kid, you then are inundated with people that you have no personal relationship with, that usually online, pontificating and giving, advice of things. And so often I will listen to these things and be like, that's not my kid. You're saying like, is your kid a picky eater? Just do this. And you're like, that wouldn't work.
Yeah.
That would not work. And I find it laughable that you are so confident that it would work. And you sort of realize pretty quickly, like, oh, every kid is so unique, and every challenge that those kids present is so specific to them, because there's so many different variables that are controlled by you and you alone, in terms of like, obviously their own unique identity, but also just like, oh, well, we don't have as much time to eat as a family together for this reason or whatever. So this variable changes, or I don't know, man. He's got some sort of thing where like, I can't just force it. I can't force him to eat anything, or like he can make himself throw up if he doesn't like something. So I guess I just have to like hope. And then there's
chicken nuggets again.
Right. Exactly. Like all these different, compromises that you make that are made with the best intentions, all these different elements. And you just really quickly realize like, I'm not going to feel bad because this person's advice doesn't fit my kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of being like, I failed as a parent, because this person, obviously this works for them, but it doesn't work for me. And so I sort of saw that and realized, well, that's kind of what advice is in general, when you don't genuinely have a personal connection to someone. And I'm sure you experience this in terms of when you talk to people, because obviously you can create that intimate relationship. And so you're speaking from a place of not authority necessarily, but certainly a place of understanding the perspectives a little better. But when you're trying to talk to people in a very broad and general way, it becomes really challenging to create some level of understanding of who they are and meeting them where they're at. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was, okay, how do I deal with that? How do I give advice when I don't know somebody? And the first thing was, well, try and create something where it requires them to enter their own DNA into the situation. So make something that feels somehow specific enough, but also broad enough that when they walk in, they'll say, wow, I'm going through this thing. And this hits me because of this, and this. And so that makes the message resonate because of all these things that I'm putting into it.
It's like writing horoscopes for the newspaper. Like you just have to make it just vague enough.
Yes.
Like, they're talking about me.
Yeah, but also specific enough that they don't just dismiss it as like, great,
Yeah.
And so finding that middle ground, and I think the first place to start is, well, if I can relate to this myself, then I can already sort of say like someone else probably will. Mm-hmm. Because as much as we all think we're very unique, we're also very similar.
The human condition is pretty universal. Yeah,
exactly. But it is, for me, the last few years have been difficult in terms of feeling like I'm in any position to give advice because, or encouragement even, because first it started with like around the Black Lives Matter movement, I started feeling very much like I'm just a sort of another white guy thinking, speaking from my position of privilege and giving advice on things I don't know what I'm talking about and things like that, which then sort of dovetailed into the COVID time where I was like, well, it feels weird even being out and going out and putting stuff up, and then people just aren't walking the streets as much, and then
no one wants to be told, keep your chin up.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
We're all miserable.
Exactly.
We don't want to keep our chin up.
Right. And then it goes into like me having a kid and it just being more challenging just to find more time and all of these things that now it's like, And then I think the final thing that's been challenging is just as you get older, sort of looking back and being like, I don't know if I agree with that statement anymore.
Mhm.
You know, I don't know if I agree with how I said it. You know, I put out a couple of books and I've looked back at them and been like, wow, my first book was like advice from a person in their 20s. And then the second book was like, you know, thoughts and ideas from a person in their 30s. And I'm now in my 40s and I'm wondering if like, well, if I ever put out another book, you know, what is that going to look like? You know, it's funny how the first one was all about like, or not all, but certainly had a lot of like, don't give up, keep, you know, make it through the struggle. And then the second one was kind of more like, well, it's okay to give up if you realize that that something just isn't, it's not everything that's hard is valuable. Sometimes things that are hard are just not working, and it's okay to give up on those things, and it's okay to realign your ideas of what you want and things like that.
We talk about that a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I think it's just interesting as an artist, you know, looking back, and especially when so much of what you're doing is advice or encouragement, you sort of realize that as you change, your ideas change, and certainly even like elements of like your spirituality and things like that shift and change as you live. And I think it's just so funny how we all think that we've like are at some like place of wisdom that we know everything, and then 10 years passes and we realize like I wasn't done learning, you know.
Right.
So it's I think it's important to, for me at least, to create a level of humility and recognizing that I don't know it all, and there's just elements of growing that are always going to happen, and that's not a bad thing. And so in many ways, that's also why it's good that it's temporary, that I'm not, you know, I'm not erecting something that will need to live on for eternity and be always right.
Smash Mouth will be the best band of all time.
Yeah,
Fight
exactly,
me.
right? Yeah. And I think then finally,
No
the
shade to
last
Smash
thing,
Mouth. I'm sure you guys are
yeah,
great.
rest in peace,
Rest
guy.
in
Yeah,
peace.
R.I.P.
But the last thing I sort of also had to get comfortable with was recognizing that not every poster is going to be applicable for every person, and that the message of like some people need to hear, you know, wait through what you're going through, and on the other side of it, you will be a stronger person. And some people need to hear you need to make the change in your life. You know what I mean? Like you need to fix this thing that you've allowed to be a broken part of you, and it's up to you to fix it or whatever, or certainly you to start taking steps in order to fix it. And those are very different things. And so it used to challenge me, and it used to be difficult for me to be okay with the poster of like, wait for it. And then the guy walking by who's like not in the season of needing to wait for it, and being like, I hope I didn't steer him wrong. You know, for me, there's just the hope of allowing those people to sort of somehow know intrinsically what they need to do, and allowing that poster to just kind of confirm that to some degree, as opposed to, you know, just the fear of I've given this person the
steering
worst
them wrong.
advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question that is probably a very therapist-y question, but I'm a therapist,
Sure,
so it's
sure.
okay.
My mom was a therapist until she retired. She was a marriage and family therapist. So
Oh, awesome.
I'm very comfortable in the therapy world.
Okay,
as it
good.
were.
Get comfortable.
Yeah.
This is going to go deep.
Let's do it.
So you've said that people are walking by or driving down the street and they see something that it's like, oh, I needed to see that.
Mm-hmm.
What was it that you needed to see? What message were you not hearing when you were coming up that would have been helpful for you?
That's a great question. And I think that's, you know, it changes, you know, and I think as you get older now, the messages that I need to hear are different than they were. And so I sort of try to, as I create art, create more stuff that is a reflection of where I'm at now. At the time when I started, I did need a lot more encouragement. I did need a lot more inspiration. I needed a lot more of someone helping me understand my value beyond what measure of success I was able to reach. I needed I needed a voice, and I assumed that other people needed the voice of like, you're not a valuable person just if the audition goes well. You're a valuable person even if you bomb the audition. You're a valuable person regardless of whether you attain enough success. Because so often I think we allow other people to assign us our value. There's also this idea of like, yeah, but if I win an Oscar, then I will know I'm a good actor. Because before that, I don't know for sure, you know? And so to me, I think that I really needed someone to say, what you create has value even before everybody else embraces it, or if nobody embraces it. So that was probably the primary message I needed at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of tried to spread out from there in terms of like recognizing the sort of balance in life of cynicism and optimism together, and seeing, you know, like one of for me, the kind of first poster that I made that kind of unlocked the ideas that I was having at the time was a poster that said, "Let's fall in love like both our parents aren't divorced." And
which we have framed on our wall. It's one of the first Morley pieces that we have. We have many Morley pieces at our house, but that was the first one.
That's great. So I think that, like, to me, that was the one that really set off this notion of optimism in a world that we acknowledge is imperfect. And the easiest thing to dismiss is hope without acknowledgement of the trials and tribulations. I mean, I think one of the things that's great about what you do is that you're not coming from a position of, I made all the right choices in my life. And if you want to live a happy and fulfilling life, just follow my right. method. It's like, you can come from a place of, I've made mistakes. I've done things that I have given me certainly a better perspective, or certainly a more nuanced perspective of the different challenges that are, you know, you face as an artist and as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those are the people that we listen to a lot more,
Mm-hmm.
and that we allow to have some kind of authority enough to give us advice and encouragement, you know?
Well, that's what I think great art can do that, you know, a motivational speech or a coach can't do,
Right.
you know, is to give that nuance, to paint a portrait of what it is to be a human being in a certain context. You know, I've always gravitated towards films, books, music that is very much sort of character driven and very much just about, call it a slice of life, but just something that is very specific about an experience or a context that you live through in life that you might not hear if you're just, you know, getting platitudes about how to live life until you see it played out in someone else's art, and then you can connect with it. And I wonder, you know, because that's, as a viewer, that's obviously really helpful for me. For you being the artist, is that therapy for you? And if so, when you sort of began this venture as an artist and the different ways you do it, what were you working through in your art that drove you to do what you do now?
I mean, I think for me,
it was a big sigh.
Well, that was the sigh of like, okay, I got to say this right without, because
we're out of time.
Yep. And I feel like I'm a person who just generally like will talk and talk until I feel like I'll make 10 different analogies until I feel like I think they got it.
I'm a big analogy guy too.
Right.
Much to my wife's chagrin, because like our arguments are like, look, it's like a farmer.
Yeah.
The farmer
right.
talk.
Yeah. I'll do a quick aside. Have you watched the Gary Goldman special on HBO?
No.
He has this one where he's like, I flunked out of analogy school. And the thing, you know, flunking out of analogy school is like, which I just thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's like we got the first analogy, Morley, but thank you for 9 more. One of the things that was also very important with my artwork was I wanted to create as little distance between the artist and the audience as possible in the way that music is created. And one of the things that I drew upon was the Imagine documentary with John Lennon, where at one point a sort of drifter comes up to his
favorite
house.
part of that.
Yeah.
My favorite part.
And he basically, the drifter is like, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says like, you know, like, how did you pull those things out of my head and make songs? And Lennon is sort of trying to gracefully say like, well, they're for me. I wrote them for me. If you got something out of them, that's great.
Come on, you have to do it in the Lennon. That's for me, man.
Yeah. Now my Lennon is very a Yellow Submarine. Like, might as well just be like a Lennon impressions are like Christopher Walken, where it's like you can only sound silly. But the idea that you can have that relationship, and certainly I think every art you can have that intimacy, but with music it's I think the most immediate, because you're seeing the person perform. You're like looking and saying they're singing words that matter to me, as opposed to even a film where you're seeing
a representation of someone else's words.
You're seeing Charlie Kaufman's words in Eternal Sunshine, but it's still, there's layers. And so you're not necessarily being like, Charlie Kaufman took those from my head. It doesn't feel quite like that direct of a connection. And so that's why I started drawing myself into these pieces that I would put up around the city, because I wanted it to be, this is me trying to reach whoever is looking at it and to create that intimacy and create that bond. And also to recognize, hopefully, or to establish this notion that like, I need this too. This is also for me. It's similar to Lennon in terms of being like, I wrote this for me, and I'm glad it was effective for you, and I'm glad that it made you feel these ways. But it starts with me, and then it spreads out from there, type of a thing, as opposed to I didn't reach into your mind and steal your thoughts, like the Drifter sort of saying. I feel like I deviated a little bit from your question.
You're dodging the question.
Yeah. What was your question really quick again, so that I can sort of not.
Well, it was just artist therapy for the artist.
Right.
And was that the impetus for you to become not just a street artist, but, you know, everything that you do as an artist, beginning with going to film school and pursuing that passion? Mm-hmm. Was it originally that? Was it a coping mechanism? And if so, for what?
I grew up in a single mother situation. I had a relationship with my dad, but I think the first and foremost, my mother was probably the person who I looked at, and for her, movies were really important, and had, you know, and she really loved movies. And so I think that we naturally grow up, and whatever our parents are passionate about, to some degree, we sort of say like, oh, movies have significance. You know, if I grew up in a household where, you know, it was sports are really significant, I might have been drawn more towards sports. But for me, it was, there was this reverence around creating, you know, art, like movies and music and things like that, which I still matter to me. But I think that a lot of people in the world have a lot easier time dismissing it and being like, a movie is just something that you put on and you enjoy, and it doesn't really matter. You know, an album is something that you play just as a soundtrack of whatever you're doing, but doesn't really have significance, you know? And so for me, I think there's always been this idea of like making something that matters and finding some value in what you're creating and doing. And that if you do that, it then makes you matter. I don't want to give the impression that I was like, if I do this, then my mom will love me, you know, kind of thing. Although there are elements of when you sort of perceive as a younger person, this is something that she says that she lifts up. I want to do that so that she can lift me up, so that I can, you know. And I think that, you know, all of the different elements of life, you know, we moved around a lot as a kid, and it was really challenging for me to make friends that I didn't then just like move away from 2 years later. And I've got to do this in order to love myself, basically, you know, which I've sort of touched on earlier. And so for me, I think reaching a place in my life, because I certainly thought when I was in high school in Iowa City, where I grew up, like once I get to New York and film school, like everything's going to click. I'm going to hit the groove of like living in the grace of who I was always meant to be, which is, I think, something that is a ideal, a notion that I think is real, but also a fiction.
It's unrealistic. Yeah, because we don't realize at that age that wherever we go, we take our issues with us.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's moving to San Francisco or New York or wherever isn't going to hide the issues that are still there. You're bringing them with you.
Yeah. And I do think that there are places where you can be like, wow, I'm actually really happy with what I'm doing with my life now, much more than I was before. And you can find that harmony in your life. But I think when you're young, it's much harder to find that. It's much harder to recognize it, I should say. When I got to college and was sort of hit with the reality of like, oh, I'm not the person I always planned on being. I'm still, just as you said, like there I am wherever I go. And
I think man once said that.
Yep. And so I think then recognizing like, what if this is everything? What if nothing is what I expected it to be? What if everything I do will be a disappointment? And then sort of facing that reality and being like, okay, well then maybe I want to try and create something that will allow me to sidestep that a little bit, or at least cope with that reality of like, what if everything is a disappointment? What if none of my dreams are going to come true and stuff? And so trying to find that place where you're serving whatever purpose you have on this earth without requiring
someone else
success and somebody else and all these different middlemen and women to help facilitate that.
Well, it's the double-edged sword of being an artist. I think in a weird way, you know, we are not our jobs, you know, and people, we make sure, and certainly as a therapist, you make sure people understand that. But the kind of the fine line that artists, that we walk as artists, is that in a weird way, we are our job, because the art that's spilling out of our soul isn't a TPS report. It isn't some, you know, lawsuit that you worked really hard on, which granted, there's value in that,
Mhm.
but there is an emotional purging of getting art out. And so there does, I think, in those instances, require some sort of validation from somebody else to say, I see you, I see what you're saying, and it affected me. So your job, you did your job well.
Right, yes.
And therefore, you as a person, as an artist, have value to me.
Mhm.
You know, it's all well and good to say in a vacuum, if I was the last man on earth, I'd still be writing songs, I'd still be
Right,
creating
yeah.
art. But would we? We don't
Yeah.
know, you know?
Yeah.
And I said this to you early on in one of our conversations about the Beatles. I always think about when they stopped touring because they couldn't hear themselves.
Right.
But they still were putting out albums. They still wanted people to be like, oh, the Beatles are so great. You know, and this goes to what you were talking about the Beatles are just human beings.
Mhm.
They still needed that validation, even
Right.
though we like to think that, like I said, as artists, we would create art in a vacuum. But it is a unique position to be in where you require someone else to say, I see what you did and I like it, and therefore it is good and it has value.
Right. Yeah.
And we want to get to a place as artists where we don't need that.
Totally.
But I think just as human beings, we need that. And like I said, as
Yeah.
it's a tough line to walk.
It's a tough line. You know, it's funny because there's like a meme of Rick Rubin talking about the importance of not letting the audience dictate your artwork, and that it's like everything should feel like a journal, and the audience should not matter. And it's funny because I feel like there are so many times, even just in terms of like, there are days when I'm like, art is the only thing that matters. And then there are days where I'm like, art doesn't matter. All that matters is living, you know, and like being in the moment and present and existing, because everything fades. And I go back and forth from day to day. And so there are days when I'm like, yeah, Rick Rubin, you're so right. And then there are days when I'm like, no, the audience does matter. The purpose of art, from my perspective, is not masturbatory. It is something where we are trying to communicate, and we hope that within communicating to another human being, we make the job of existence a little easier. Yeah. And so for me, the place I've sort of landed at with audience and artist is you've got to be a craftsman of boats. You have to be able to, you can make them as unique and personal to you, and just like your vision of a boat can be 100% your vision, but it has to float.
Still has to float.
It has to float. So it's like something can be interpreted a million different ways. A piece of art can be interpreted a million different ways, or a poem, for example, can be interpreted in a million different ways, unless it's written in gibberish, and then it can be interpreted in one way, and it makes no sense. You know what I mean? And so for me, it's just like, so that means the only job is to just have it written in a language that can be read by somebody. Mm-hmm. And then they can interpret it a million different ways. And that to me is where it's like, finding that balance is the trick, I think, as an artist, of how much is this for the audience? How much is this for myself?
Yeah, that's very true. You were talking earlier about integrity and how in the 90s that was a word. I remember being in a band. We were a 90s band. We started the band in 94. Mm-hmm. 6 years of life in a band in the 90s before we became an early aughts band.
Sure.
And the phrase artistic integrity got thrown around a lot. I mean, that was like every single demo. It was like there was this constant push and pull between how much are we going to pander to an audience and how much are we going to do what's true to our authentic selves. Mm-hmm. And we were moving more and more towards pop music.
Sure.
And there was an extent to which the word pop was a bad word. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to reject that for that reason, because it was like anything that was pop was considered selling out.
Sure. Disposable and unimportant to the music scene, I would imagine too. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like the word pop comes from popular. Mm-hmm. Something being popular is not, it can correlate, but it doesn't equate to being worthless, mm-hmm. Right?
Right, yeah.
And you look back, we look back at our favorite artists of all time, the greatest musicians we enjoyed their music most.
Smash Mouth.
R.I.P.
Exactly. That and Chumbawamba, right?
Yep.
No, but the Beatles, perfect example. They straddled that line with absolute integrity and mm-hmm. brilliance, where they made #1 hit records, but they also expressed themselves as artists in a way that was truly unique and continued to push the boundaries of what you can do within that medium.
Number nine.
But you know what though? I'm also fascinated to me with when the example of the Beatles, of there being an era where they were not looked at as cool. They were not looked at as boundary pushing as they were, and as innovative as they were as musicians and artists, that we now can look back and see, like, I mean, the Clash ripped on the Beatles, you know, like phony Beatlemania. Like, it's like that there was an era. And I think it's funny because now we kind of look back that, like, pre the anthology, there was a good amount of time where the Beatles were thought of as just being nostalgia, kind of like, you know, disposable kind of stuff. Like, yeah, I think that they were never looked at as being a joke, but I think there was even a backlash to them that now we can look back and say, I think with a little bit more hindsight, recognize their genius. But it also goes to show that, like, even the Beatles can go through a moment in time where culture has dismissed them, you know? And certainly, obviously, all of the solo stuff and, you know, in terms of people being like, who cares, you know, and all that stuff. I just think that it's so interesting when we can realize that, like, stuff that we say is like objectively one thing is still subjective, you know? And so I think that this idea of artistic integrity even is so amorphous and so easy to, you know, we now look at how online, how like everybody can out self-righteous another person. Everyone can be like, yeah, you think you're progressive, but you do this and you're not progressive enough in this way. Or you think that you know, have all the answers, but this, and all that stuff. And you sort of realize, like, even that it's like, oh, I thought we were all on the same side about this, you know, thing. And it's like, oh, but now you're telling me I'm actually worse than Hitler. You know, because I didn't phrase something right or whatever. Artistic integrity is a little bit like bona fides in any kind of area where it's so easy for people to armchair quarterback and to sort of say like, nah, you were never this or whatever. Like,
it's also the nature of the business model now,
right?
That selling out in the way we defined it in the 90s is required.
Yeah,
because you could sell albums and tour and never have your stuff on a commercial or TV show, and that's you staying true to your artistic integrity.
Right.
Well, now that is the model for getting your music out there, getting it placed on TV, on TikTok.
Right.
I mean, and so is that selling out, or is that just doing what we were doing 30 years ago, just in the current method that is acceptable?
Yeah, totally.
You know, as a filmmaker, you didn't want to be on network TV. You wanted to be doing indie films. Well, now you know, the streamers carry independent films. So if you're on Netflix, are you a sellout, or are you getting your art out there? You know,
totally.
It's the paradigm has shifted. So I think that's taken some of the pressure off of artists to feel
absolutely. And I think that because so much of selling out is related to the business element of it, that as the business changes, then of course this notion of artistic integrity changes. I was listening to this podcast called 60 Songs That Define the 90s. One of the episodes was about Fugazi, and they were talking about, is it possible to have those convictions and actually be a band? And essentially they were saying, like, not unless the parents were supporting the people doing this music, you know, because like the idea of like, we don't sell t-shirts, we sell every ticket is $5. That only works if you have built up a fan base where you can sell out the place only selling tickets for $5.
It's an unsustainable business model.
Exactly. It's unsustainable now, because at the time that they created, like that Fugazi was establishing themselves, and certainly their record label, and certainly the hardcore scene that was birthed out of DC, but like, all of these ideas are very tied to the era that they were created, because they could sell 50,000 or whatever records, and that would be enough to pay their rent and allow them to not have day jobs or whatever. I was talking to an actor friend of mine, and he was telling me about how he was talking to a much older actor in New York, and a theater actor, and they were saying, that person was saying, every theater actor in New York has a secret. And their secret is maybe they found an apartment that was rent controlled. Maybe their parents, have enough money that they can help sort of support them. They have some sort of, they invested early in something and now they live off of that. So it's like, and to me, it's a little bit like, I wish that we could all acknowledge, you know, when we're talking about this notion of artistic integrity, because certainly in the street art scene, it's very real, you know, this idea of like, and people like Banksy creating this notion of like what street art is supposed to be, the purity of it. It's not supposed to be tied in with any corporation. It's not supposed to be. And certainly for a while, there was a lot of times when corporations were trying to latch on to that sense of integrity. They wanted the stylistic thing of like, this is cool. And what is cool is there's no business model to cool, you know? And so I'm sure for you, as you guys were like, the more successful you were getting, the more sense that there was like, but people don't think we're cool anymore because now we're too popular to be cool, you know? We're cool to the wrong people or whatever.
Yeah.
Certainly you can recognize that as the business changes, that change, you know, you're like, well, as an artist, it's like, is it cool to be a starving artist, you know, and to be completely broke? Is there nobility in that? Or is there nobility in being like, yeah, I'm an artist, but I also have a day job. And I do these things. And so it, you know, it allows me to not monetize my art quite as intensely as I would have to if it was if I was expecting it to support me. And it also, there's an element too of like, you don't look at the art that doesn't make you lots of money as the, you know, sort of failure, the child that like didn't live up to your expectations of like, I built you because I thought you were going to make me wealthy and you didn't do that. And now I'm just embarrassed of you or whatever. So all that to say,
it's the Pinkerton corollary.
Yes,
Pinkerton was the best, even though it didn't sell.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that begs the question, and pardon my ignorance and pardon me if this is a crass question, but we all know Banksy sells paintings and things for a lot of money, right? Is that the kind of thing where there's like the exception to the rule, or is there a business model for a street artist? Can you make a career and have sustainability?
Yeah, because you've had shows, you've been around the world, you've had books, you know. So
it's like the punk rock scene where you will have people that know that any level of success is too much, or not even a success, notoriety, or what could be perceived as, you know, success. Because certainly there are a lot of people, and I'm sure that you've experienced this in the music world too, where it's like the perception of like, you have billions of dollars, you know, and you're just like, no, actually, when we agreed to do that, it was because I needed a car and I didn't even have a car or whatever. You know, like I'm always shocked at the business model of music, certainly these days, where you're just like, yeah, the people that you really look up to, they make less money than you do. I promise you. At your day job that you have, they make less money because all of their money came from touring and they had to spend 6 months on the road to get that money, all this other stuff. And certainly that changes when you reach different like plateaus of success in the music industry. But as an artist, it's very similar, where to some people, any success is your sellout, you know? With Banksy, there's this element of like, it's only because I control everything. And if I control everything, then nothing can be sellout because everything was my choice, you know? There's kind of a few different ways of looking at the business model of being an artist. I would say, like, to me, there's the Banksy model and there's like the Shepard Fairey model. Shepard Fairey, who did like the Obama Hope poster and Obey, things like that. And like Banksy sells one painting for $50,000 or whatever, you know? Shepard Fairey sells prints of his work. And yes, he also has originals and things like that he sells for more, but he also is like, I would rather have 100 people have one of my prints than one person having one of my pieces or whatever. And the one version that the scarcity creates the value. And then there's the other version where it's like, no, I'm not interested in scarcity. I'm interested in spreading my vision as far and making
spreading my artistic seed.
Yeah, exactly. And making it as accessible as I can. I've always skewed way more towards the accessibility level. I never wanted anybody to come to my show and not be able to buy something if they wanted to. And, you know, of course, as an artist, there's moments of imposter syndrome, and you'd make X amount of dollars playing a show. And then there are years when you make less, even if like, it's not even like an upward trajectory. We're like, oh yeah, we played that show for beers or whatever, you know, and then we're playing for, you know, audiences where we have this much of a percentage of the door or whatever. And then you sort of realize like, I'm selling it for less. Like now it's like, I can't make those same prices or whatever. And you start to feel like guilty that like, but the guy that bought my painting 2 years ago spent more money on it, you know, and all these different things that can eat at you. And ultimately you just kind of need to just dismiss them all, I think, and just sort of find whatever level is acceptable for you. So for me, as far as like the level of feeling like a sellout or not a sellout is just, have I had to compromise any of my, what I viewed as
artistic integrity.
My artistic integrity? Because it's really, it has to be defined by you. Like, you can't let other people define what your convictions are, because the minute you do that, you realize, oh, there's a trillion people. And just like online, when we post and we think we're making a general positive statement, someone can say like, you said that wrong, or you did this wrong. Because I'm not going to, please everyone. I got to please myself, as Rick Nelson would say,
Mm-hmm.
Garden party.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'm more of a catch the wind.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, what about creating your art aside from the obvious, like I might get arrested doing this?
Mm-hmm.
What are things that pop up in your mind in terms of, like, I don't want to go as far as to say anxiety, but are there things about, is there a sense of like, I don't have anything to say anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm in my 40s now, and my messages, like, what are things that still create that conflict in you as an artist, or just as a person in general?
Well, certainly the idea of, like I touched on earlier, like this poster was the wrong advice for this person. Mm-hmm. This idea of what if I create something that years later I don't stand by, that I think was just a general bad sort of, because so often, we have good intentions, and the best intentions can so easily, especially when consumed on a mass level, warp into like just these horrible things that we wind up creating without even knowing it. So that creates anxiety. I think I feel anxiety certainly with the idea of like writer's block, because for me, I've found that the creation is where I feel the most joy. It's not in the celebration. It's not in even like finishing it, because the minute I finish something, I am sort of like, okay, what am I going to do next? What's going to be the next thing? And it's not because it's an addiction. It's more just that, like, when I'm creating, those are the moments that I feel like I'm really kind of like living in the harmony of who I am as a person, and as a person in this world. And so for me, when I feel writer's block, that is when I am sort of like, I feel rudderless, you know what I mean? And so that creates anxiety of when I feel like this will never end. I've become very fixated on this idea of, you reach the peak and the peak is over with. I mean, there's certainly a lot of people, and I'm sure you've seen it in the music industry. Like for example, I've worked a lot with the band Everclear. I did like their the album cover for their last live album, and I've worked with the singer on his solo album. And I find that he has reached a place that I find very interesting, of recognition of like the top of the mountain. I've reached it, and I'm never going back there again. It'll never be as good, certainly because the business has changed. And certainly just because he's older now, and he's just like, I'm not a 30-year-old guy who's going to be number one on TRL anymore. Like, and for me, I think that when we're younger, we create this thing in ourselves of like, I'm going to get to the place and just be there forever. Mm-hmm. I just got to get there, and then I can just be there forever. And it's just it's not sustainable. And, I just think that recognizing that is a very human and a very, humbling, but ultimately liberating thing. Yeah. Exactly. And so for me, it's like, there are moments where I was like, man, I did some pretty great, some pretty cool stuff happened, but street art is also kind of ebbs and flows, and the flavor of the month status of it is kind of faded. And now it's like people are, in some ways it's been parodied and looked at as being a joke and things like that. And you have these, these ideas of like, oh, I'm a street artist. And that you just want to be like, get out of here, man. That's, dealing with the idea of that, I think, has been a really interesting thing, just because it's such a small level that I've experienced it. Whereas I think of someone like, what's it like for like Pearl Jam to be like, yeah, we were the most important thing in the world for a while, and now we're not. We still make art. Mm-hmm. But one of my favorite bands is this band called Archers of Loaf in the 90s. And the singer is a working musician, but he also does these house tours where he'll do like play in the backyard of someone's house, and it's good because it's like you get all of the ticket prices. You're not splitting them with the things, and you can create a really intimate and nice thing. And I hosted him playing, and it's a beautiful experience, and I highly recommend, if you have a cool backyard, to host little shows like that. But afterwards, I was helping him load his gear back in, and we were talking, and he was talking about how he's like, I've recognized that my audience base isn't growing. It's never going to it's not going to explode. Like, I've reached the ceiling of what my audience is, and I'm now just making artwork for them. I'm making music for that audience, and it's maybe not going to get any bigger, but it's enough. And I'm fortunate enough, this is him talking, that audience is big enough that it can sustain me on a modest level. And this can be my job. Mm-hmm. And I think that to me is such a healthy and wonderful place to be. And I want to reach that place where as a person you can find some sense of like satisfaction, and you can be like, I'm okay with it not getting higher than this or bigger than this or whatever. And with that, you can just keep then creating at that level of that satisfied level, and not creating with the angst that comes along with ambition, basically.
I just had a flashback to about 1995 being with my bandmates, and I think either Jesse or Mickey came into band rehearsal and said, "Have you guys heard of Archers of Loaf?" And Adam goes, "Urchins of Love?"
Urchins of Love. That's great. That should, if they were ever playing like a secret show, that's what they would list themselves as. Yeah. They've got one of those names that like is like Google proof, where it's like you don't have to worry about like everyone. You Google that and you will find the band.
Yeah.
It's not like one of those things where like, you know,
Archersoflove.net. That's a marketing agency in London.
But you think about like you know, so many bands, it's so funny where it's like you want to find the band name where it's like it sounds like it's like a real band name. It doesn't sound like a bogus band name.
But you have to put in blank blank the band at the end.
Exactly. Yeah. Everclearmusic.com, for example, as opposed to just like, it's so funny when you think about picking a band name. Because it's such a silly band name. But I talked to him actually, and he was talking about how. So he started this band Archers of Loaf in the 90s. They're like Built to Spill, kind of like indie rock of that 90s, and kind of and then that band sort of broke up, and he created this band called Crooked Fingers that he plays, he played in for years. And then he started putting out solo stuff under the name Eric Bachman. And it's just interesting. I was talking to him about how as he's gone on in his life, he's gotten more and more sort of like removed the layers of not anonymity, but just impersonalness. He's basically just gotten more and more honest and more transparent with him, and his music even has gone from being a little bit more abstract, which was, I think, much more in vogue in the 90s in terms of like lyrics that are more abstract, certainly like, Nirvana and things like that, where, I'm a mosquito, my libido, things like that, where it's like there is some sense that can be found, but it's a little bit harder to reach that. Whereas now he's like, all of his lyrics are much more story based or just like less abstract and more clear. And it just, he was just talking about like, as I've gotten older, that's become more important to me, to sort of remove those things that were once comforting to me, those things that could kind of hide some truths behind like, well, it's whatever you want it to mean. It's like, but you know what it means to you, you just don't want to. And it's like, well, I don't want to like tell people what it means. And you're like, okay. But so for me, I think it's again, just finding that place of where you're more comfortable with being vulnerable and open and saying, this is what I wanted the song to mean. Of course you leave it open to mean something else for somebody else. But I think that there is that, again, as part of that harmony of finding yourself, where you're like, I'm okay with people knowing that this is something I struggle with, or I'm okay with knowing that this is something that a mistake that I made or whatever, and a love that went away,
It's something that comes up. I mean, it's come up so many times today, and I think it comes up often in our conversations of this kind of the value of perspective and the value of hindsight and being able to look back at things we did in our teens, our 20s, our 30s, and say, this worked, this didn't. But also your perspective changes. And like you say, the advice you would give in your 20s and 30s is different than the advice you'd give now. It's like a commencement speaker. At high school, the valedictorian is all about hope and tomorrow and the next day.
Right.
You go to a college and you have somebody in their 50s who's giving a speech, and it's all about like, buy real estate. It's practical.
Start planning for your retirement.
It's practical advice,
so true.
About like the things that you think are important at 18 aren't, and
or are only important to
when
you
you're
as
18.
Yeah.
And I think that it's so valuable for our listeners to kind of, wherever you are in your life, it's okay for those things to be important to you now.
Right.
It's okay for them not to be important to you later. I mean, we've talked about, as an actor, like, after I've reached a certain plateau, is it okay to say, I don't want to do this anymore? Is it giving up, or is it, like you say, recognizing that it's not working anymore?
Right.
And wherever you are in your own journey, giving yourself the permission and the grace to say, that's not who I am anymore, or that's not who I want to be anymore.
Right.
And I'm okay with the metamorphosis that I'm going through, or that I have gone through, and to just wherever you are, wherever you're going, there you are, just to live in that space freely and with comfort and with with, be proud of wherever you are on that journey, and don't try to lament where you used to be or be upset that you're not where you think you should be.
That was very well said. I think you probably could have put in 6 or 7 more analogies.
Yeah, I agree.
I would have, but no, that's very well said. Well,
stay tuned for the post show where we'll have.
That was great, though.
Well, I've found that to be true in my life, and I see it in my clients a lot. And it's interesting. It's something that I don't know if anyone can really prepare you for it, because when you're young, it's kind of age appropriate when you're a teenager to think you have everything figured out. It's like, okay, I know who I am. I know what the world is. I know what my values are. And then you get a little bit older and you get your ass handed to you by life, and you realize like, oh yeah, everything I thought was real was just my perspective then. And I've gone through different stages of that at different phases of my life. And I've come to understand that, life has seasons, and in different seasons of your life, there are different things that are appropriate for that, phase of life, but also just unique to you in that circumstance of your life. And a lot of people are looking for purpose as if it's just something that's handed to you when you're young.
Right.
And that's just going to carry you forth throughout your life. But especially in today's economy, it's like people are changing careers like every 6 years. And that's scary on one level, but on another level, it's kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea that I would not be in the band at some point and having to deal with that reality, and that my life wouldn't be about me being a performer anymore, was sad, and it was tragic, and it was loss, and it was heartbreak. But then fast forward another decade and another decade of life and perspective, I realized, would I even be that fulfilled doing what I was doing 20 years ago now? And the answer is probably no, because what I'm doing now has greater depth to it for me personally. I'm connecting with people in a different way that is appropriate for where I'm at in my evolution today. And I'm able to utilize parts of myself that I wasn't able to utilize at that phase of my life.
Right.
And so when I look forward now at this point in my life, I think to myself, I have no idea what my priorities are going to be when I'm 60,
right?
Or what my passion's going to be compared to what it is now. And that's actually exciting to me now.
Yeah.
It's not scary. It's like, well, life still has more to offer me that is unknown.
Right.
That when it happens, I'm going to discover it, and it's going to bring possibly new passion and new purpose. And that's going to continue to evolve, hopefully until the point where, you're on your deathbed and you can look back and you can say, look at all this shit that I did. When I was a teenager, I was passionate about this. Wasn't that crazy?
Right.
But that was kind of cool. And I thought this was the biggest thing in the world, and Soundgarden changed my life. And then when I was in my 20s, it was Prince, and it was something totally different.
Right.
And then when I was in my 40s, I was reading like existential philosophy and learning about clinical psychology and all these things. And so it's like, that to me, that's a life worth living. And there's something very exciting about that idea. And I don't know, as an artist and being a lover of art, being able to connect with different things at different phases of your life in a different way. You kind of touched on it earlier. It's like, well, the advice that I give now is different than it was when I was younger.
Yeah. And I think, it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot lately about how to, this is a weird way of saying it, but it's how to stay cool. Like I look at some of the artists that it's funny. I read this book, Your Favorite Band Is Killing Me. And it was about the infamous kind of rivalries in music. And they were,
Blur
Oasis was one, like Stones, Beatles. Not all of them were always contentious. Some of them were just sort of friendly competitions. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. Stephen Hayden. One of the things that is in there is Eric Clapton versus Jimi Hendrix. And essentially what the statement is made at the end is that Jimi Hendrix wins because he died cool. And Eric Clapton got old and floppy haired and doing acoustic versions of Layla and things like that. And there's a moment where you can't maintain that coolness. And so I've thought about it, and I was like, is there any example of someone who kind of just kept their cool? And I mean, Bowie certainly. Yeah. I think there are. And, for me, it's also the artists that it's like, well, they also kept an open mind. They weren't like you read these stories about the politics of some of these older people, and you're just like, it's just because you're old, man. It's just because you're old and you can't, you've
didn't
decided
feel that way in 1967.
Yeah, exactly. Like you've decided that whatever your politics were at a certain point, either they got more conservative or whatever, or they just became you were like, no, we solved racism. I don't need to care about trans people. They're taking it too far. We shouldn't have to, but it's like, and I think that then there are the artists that I think just are always kind of like keeping an open mind to some degree and allowing sort of the world to change and recognizing that they need to sort of change with it rather than being like, oh, no. Like we were as progressive as we needed to be in 1967. And now it's, you know, woke culture is ruining everything or whatever. And for me, then I think about certain people, Bowie, for example, Iggy Pop, or I think about like filmmakers like, you know, Jim Jarmusch, where I'm like, you're still cool, man, you know, or like Neil Young, where I'm like, somehow you just, sometimes I think it's just like, just not pontificating and not constantly being like, I have relevant things to say. And it's like, no, Van Morrison, you don't necessarily, you know, like,
but all those guys don't give a fuck. Like you could tell, like that's the through line. Is like all those, like Jim Jarmusch didn't care 40 years ago about selling a single ticket to his movies. He made these weird things, and that's the through line. You know, I think there is a certain element of, yeah, I was in Cream and it was cool, but now I need to sell my greatest hits album. Right. You know what I mean? So there is I now give a fuck.
Right.
And I think that takes away from your coolness factor.
Absolutely.
In some weird, twisted way.
And I think that like that whole idea of like the Neil Young idea of like burn out or fade away. There's a third option, and that's be Neil Young. You know what I mean? Like don't do either, you know? And I think that guys like that make it impossible to think of like, you can still sort of like, and granted, someone would say like, do you love Neil Young's last record? Do you love it as much as you like Harvest Moon? And I'm like, no, but do I still think that there's relevance to him creating art that I'm like, you know, I want to see? Like for me, I just feel like it's like, create it, but just don't expect to be the forefront. Like my whole thing about like, look, Ridley Scott should still be able to make a movie. Martin Scorsese should still be able to make a movie. Should they make $250 million movies? No, I think we should spread that out to more, you know, up and coming voices and sort of like, and I'm not saying that they don't make work that is valuable. It's just to me, the element of how much money those things cost. And it's just like, we don't need to have $250 million Ridley Scott movies every, you know, year or whatever. So anyway, I'm definitely veering off, but that said, that I think that, you know, is there this place where you can, as an older person, look back and not sort of turn like that Batman thing of like, watch yourself turning into the villain or whatever. Like, can you find that place of harmony, you know, where you can look back and have some wisdom about the things that you did and some perspective.
Let me answer that question from our son's perspective.
Okay.
No, there is no way. We are not cool and we'll continue to be less cool.
Isn't cool one of the things that we were describing as like your perspective on it changes in time inherently? Like the cool is obviously subjective, and it's not just subjective to the person, but to the time in which you're in that age range where cool matters. And so what was cool then is not cool now. It's constantly changing and evolving. And for me, I was never that consumed with being cool. I know that sounds weird being in a band to say that. The other guys in my band took care of that enough for all of us. Like I wasn't really that concerned with like us dressing the part or what the image was visually. I just wanted to play my music. You know, I just wanted to sound like when we first started, like Pearl Jam or like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. Like that was cool to me because those were my heroes and I wanted to sound like that. So maybe my perspective is a little bit different because that wasn't the main thing, was to be cool. Right. But even more so as I've aged, I'm like, you know, trends change. The things that we associate with coolness it's not permanent. There's no permanence to it. Yeah. And so the people you're describing, like Neil Young, did he ever strive to be cool?
It's like what Doc said in terms of like the not giving a fuck. And like, and I think that as I've gotten older, certainly the coolest guy in the room or girl is the person that is most comfortable with themselves. Yeah. And that confidence in who you are shines out so much more than the somehow figuring out the Rubik's cube of how to make everybody think you're cool. You know what I mean?
Think of what Bowie pulled off, you know, his look, his vibe, you know, and I remember thinking like going back and looking at kids in school and the kid that showed up with a suit and tie on, like now you think, well, that's awesome. Like what confidence. Right. Then you were just like, what a nerd, you know what I mean? Totally. Like, but there's an authenticity, again, a theme that comes up a lot as actors. We see it. It's like when someone is just not afraid, they stop putting on airs and stop trying to be what the casting director wants to see, and they just are themselves, and people go, wow, that blew me away. It wins out 10 times out of 10. Yeah. You know?
Well, to remove it from the conversation about art, to broaden it just to our experience of being human beings. And we touched on this a little bit, the difference between sort of narcissism, ego, and real confidence, right? And so like you meet a human being, it's very easy to misconstrue cool or this air of confidence, or wearing the sort of
mask
the costume of the moment that says I'm cool, and peacocking in a certain way, right? And somebody who just owns what's authentic to them, regardless of how it fits into the landscape of what is cool. Right. And that really speaks to you in a way that's different. When you notice that in another human being and they're expressing themselves in a way, it's like they really don't seem to care as to whether this is what's on trend.
Yeah.
Or even like, I'm going to set a trend, like I'm going to be so forward thinking. They're just doing what is oozing from their soul.
Totally. Like I remember the moment when I was like struck by, wow, the B-52s were fucking cool.
Yeah.
Like not like they were goofy to me at the time, and I was just like, Love Shack. But you watch, especially some of like the earlier stuff, even pre-Love Shack, and you're just like, no, these guys are like objectively cool because they are so themselves, and they walk in a confidence with that, you know. I guess one of the things that I'm fascinated by in this conversation is the internal debate of how real the things that matter to us when they matter are. Like when we were 18, the things that mattered to us, and now we look back and we're like, they didn't matter.
Right.
Did they never matter? Or I guess it's just one of those, it's sort of like being in love with someone and you find out they're cheating on you and you realize like, okay, so was that love real? And it's like, it was, even though maybe their love was not necessarily as real, but your love was real. So all of when you have to look back and be like, I need to now discard every emotion I had for that person because they betrayed me and it was all lies. And it's like, no, actually, whatever you experienced was real because you got to be the person that authenticated that, not the other people. And so I guess I find that to be a fascinating idea of like, how much do we create our own realities and make those realities real? Because we are the people that decide what's real and what's not when we're living it.
How much do those outside influences dictate our reaction to it, or is it all,
Well, now you're getting into that existential philosophy that I spoke
which
of,
will be our next episode, because obviously 3 guys from the 90s, we could talk about this stuff all day.
Absolutely. I think we should dedicate a whole episode to some
existential.
Of this. No, because to put a bow on it just briefly, meaning is relative. And as human beings, we are meaning creating machines. We're looking to find meaning in everything that we do. That's what sets us apart from every other animal in the animal kingdom, right? Our brains are evolved. It's a problem solving. It's a way of coping with things. It's a way of trying to find answers, solutions to things. And in that sense, I believe that we're all creative entities.
Right.
A lot of people say, oh, I'm not creative, I'm not artistic.
Sure.
And it's like, well, every single day when you have to make a decision about how to live your life in whatever way, you're being creative, right?
Very true, yeah.
And so part of that is looking at whatever we're dealing with in our life and ascribing some meaning to it. And that could be done in a way that's really helpful to us, that lifts us up and gives us ways, perspectives that empower us, or it can be detrimental to us sometimes. And that's where the mental health problems come in, when you're ascribing meanings to things that become not helpful, that become self-destructive, because it's a negative meaning. And even that, there is an extent to which it's a coping mechanism. There's a reason why you had adopted strategy for coping to get through something. But then at a certain point, it's become more problematic than problem solving.
Sure.
But I think that's the reason why at any point of our life, whatever we're going through at that moment, what feels relevant to us is meaningful to us, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily meaningful to anyone else.
Right.
I had a therapist for about 10 years who was a very similar to me, except a whole generation removed. He was my dad's age. He was a musician first who got sober in midlife and then became a therapist. It was very funny because, there's always that generation gap. But we would talk about music, and we had a lot of crossover. We'd talk about the Beatles. I love the music of his generation, so it was easy to talk about 60s Britpop and the Meters and James Brown and stuff like that. But then whenever he would talk about stuff from my generation, there was like just a disconnect. I remember one day he came in, he's like, I saw this new artist on YouTube. she's like a piano player. And he started describing it, and I was like, who is he talking about? And then I figured out he was talking about Tori Amos. And I was like, wow, you just missed Tori Amos completely.
Right.
And I was like, that was right in the heart of my teenage years. And that music was so relevant to me. But you were in your 40s at the time, and it was irrelevant to you, or it wasn't even on your radar.
Right.
That's like Bad Bunny to us or something.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah.
And I have a lot of just understanding of that now, being in my 40s myself now. And there's just, everything is relative in that regard. And the meaning that we ascribe to it, that doesn't make it any less meaningful.
Right.
Because meaning is just relative to our context.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you create art that connects with anyone, that just means that it's relevant to them in that moment. It doesn't mean that it has relevance across the galaxy.
For all space and time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So anyway.
No, that's great. Meaning creating machines. That's great. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it's humbling when you can look back and sort of see like the errors of your ways, see where you're like, man, I wish I had just enjoyed that more instead of, feeling the obligation to inject angst or to inject some sense of like, I mean, I think about like, that's the main thing as a father now, that with my child, I just want him to be allowed to feel more joy. Mm-hmm. I want to be like, you don't worry about, somehow you might convince yourself that you need to worry about X, Y, Z. And it's just like, you know what, you're young, just enjoy. Because there will come a moment where you will, bend down to get a quarter and go, and realize that you are old and that like, there's, so but at the same time, I think it's really important, in terms of, for me, understanding young people like my child, the youths, is to, while acknowledging, I remember those days and how silly I was, but to also be like, but it's real for them.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I think that was the big thing about like, even like the Breakfast Club was like the acknowledgement that, prior to John Hughes, whatever they're dealing with isn't really serious, but there was this idea of like, no, he took the drama seriously. Mm-hmm. And even though now I can, or even someone say like Catcher in the Rye, it's like this idea of like validating someone's experiences at a certain time of their life, at a certain season, things that matter to my kid now. Like I can recognize like, kiddo, I know you really want dessert number 2. This is worth having a tantrum over for you. I know it's like ridiculous, but it's real to him, And so for me, it's like acknowledging that and taking that seriously. And then obviously as his life progresses, continuing to do that with things that are much more important to him, that are less perhaps silly, like the second dessert, but to be like his first heartbreak and be like, I know this really matters to you, but I promise to you, you're giving it a meaning that later you will say, I was being dramatic because it felt satisfying to be heartbroken and to be able to write sad songs. And that gave me some sense of purpose and meaning. That was the machine that I, utilized then.
That's the perspective that, like you say, we all kind of are striving for.
Right.
And as long as we stay open to that, in 10 years, the next perspective will kick in. I think we'll make it through. We can talk about this stuff all day with you. We really
endlessly.
Appreciate it.
That's so great to
tell
be
the
here.
people at home where they can find your work. We'll put some things up on the Hard to Breathe podcast Instagram page, some of your work too.
Morleyart.com. Morley Artist is my Instagram thing. And I guess just if you live in LA and you walk around and you see it, that I'm the guy that hopefully is giving you some encouragement and little pieces of positive advice. I don't know. We'll see.
You gave us encouragement and positive
I
advice.
hope so. It's
Absolutely.
been an honor being here, you guys. I really enjoy and appreciate the chance to just go on and on and on. And
we'll edit it.
Please do.
We'll
Please
cut most of your stuff
cut
out.
it down so that it's just like, you can just have it be like, what do you think about this? And then it's done.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you coming down and doing this. It's been a fascinating conversation, and
talking about seasons. I'm definitely a summer, and you guys are definitely winters, right? We know.
I don't know. I feel like I'm an autumn all the way.
Really?
But maybe sometimes other people are better judges of that.
Leave us a comment and let us know.
Well, a whole other episode.
Exactly about
seasons.
Our seasons.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been another fascinating episode of the Harder to Breathe podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.